The invitation was a whisper of cardstock, cream and gold, impossibly elegant and utterly terrifying. Corinne held it like a primed explosive. The name on the envelope was hers, but the world it beckoned her into was not. It had been 5 years since she had inhabited that world, 5 years since its gravitational pull had almost torn her apart. The wedding of Minjun, the sister of the man she once loved, was not an event. It was a summons. She chose her dress with the precision of a soldier choosing armor, a deep sapphire silk that fell in a clean, severe line to her ankles. It was beautiful, but it was not loud. It was designed to glide through rooms, not to command them. It was a miscalculation. In this world, subtlety was mistaken for weakness, and she was about to walk into a coliseum where the lions were dressed in couture and starved for drama. The estate sprawled across the hills of a private California canyon, a monument to the kind of wealth that doesn't just buy privacy, but manufactures its own silence. As her car approached the gate, a man in a black suit with an earpiece stepped forward, holding up a hand. He was polite, but his eyes were chips of obsidian. "Invitation, please," he said, his voice a flatline. Corinne passed the card through the window. He examined it under a small, intense light, checking the watermark, the embossed seal. It was a security check worthy of a state dinner. She could feel the judgment radiating from him, the silent question, "You?" He looked from the impossibly expensive invitation to her face, a black woman alone in a modest sedan, and the cognitive dissonance was a palpable thing in the air between them. He finally nodded, his expression unreadable, and waved her through. The hostility had begun before she even parked her car. The ceremony was being held in the Rose Garden, a breathtaking amphitheater of manicured nature overlooking the Pacific. Guests mingled on the lawn, champagne flutes in hand, their laughter like the tinkling of expensive, brittle glass. As Corinne stepped from the stone pathway onto the grass, a hush seemed to follow her. It wasn't overt. It was a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure, the way the air changes before a storm. Conversations didn't stop, but they lowered in pitch. Heads didn't whip around, but they turned slowly, eyes lingering on her before flicking away. It was a masterclass in social exclusion, 100 tiny cuts delivered with perfect smiles. She was an anomaly, a glitch in their gilded matrix, and they were all silently, collectively agreeing to ignore the error until it went away. She found an empty chair near the back, a strategic retreat. But there was no real safety here. The whispers were everywhere, weaving through the scent of roses and salt spray. "Who is that?" "I heard she was a mistake from his past. Minjun has such a kind heart, inviting strays." Each phrase was a poison dart, and though her face remained a mask of serene neutrality, she felt every one land. She focused on the details, the impossibly white runner down the aisle, the archway dripping with orchids and peonies, the string quartet playing something classical and sad. She focused on anything but the wall of ice that had formed around her. A woman in a Chanel suit the color of a flamingo, her face a taut mask of disdain, walked past. She was trailed by 2 other women, her acolytes. As she passed Corinne's chair, the woman, who someone had referred to as Mrs. Choi, spoke just loudly enough for the sound to carry. "Some people have no sense of propriety. They see an open door and assume it's for them." Corinne didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the silk of her dress over her knee, her movements deliberate and calm. Her composure was a foreign language they didn't understand, and it infuriated them. They wanted a scene. They wanted tears or a panicked retreat. She would give them nothing. The staff, however, were different. A young waiter approached her, his hands visibly trembling as he offered her a glass of water. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely a whisper, and he refused to make eye contact, not out of disdain, but out of what looked like fear. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid for her, or perhaps afraid of what he knew that the other guests did not. It was the first clue that the ground beneath her was not as unstable as it seemed. The isolation intensified. It became a performance for the benefit of the crowd. Guests would walk towards her row of seats, see her, and then abruptly change direction, finding a sudden, urgent need to speak to someone on the opposite side of the garden. It was a synchronized shunning, a silent, cruel ballet. Corinne felt a familiar ache settle in her chest, the ghost of a pain she thought she had buried 5 years ago. This was why she had left. Not because of him, not because of Jinwoo, but because of this. The suffocating judgment, the unspoken rules, the constant, draining pressure of being the outsider who had somehow breached the walls. She had loved him, but she couldn't breathe in his world. And now, she was back in the vacuum, and the air was just as thin as she remembered. Mrs. Choi, emboldened by Corinne's stoicism, decided the passive approach wasn't yielding enough entertainment. She circled back, her champagne flute held delicately in her manicured hand. As she drew level with Corinne, she made a theatrical stumble, a clumsy, unbelievable lurch. Champagne, pale gold and bubbling, sloshed over the rim of the glass, arcing through the air. It wasn't aimed at Corinne's dress, a move that would have been too obvious. Instead, it splashed onto the pristine white runner just beside her feet, a deliberate stain marking her territory. "Oh, my heavens!" Mrs. Choi exclaimed, her voice dripping with false distress. "How clumsy of me!" She looked down at the stain, then up at Corinne, her eyes glittering with malice. The implication was clear. "You are a mess, a stain on this perfect day." The surrounding guests murmured in performative sympathy for Mrs. Choi. They watched Corinne, their faces alight with predatory anticipation. This was the moment. The public humiliation was now undeniable. Surely, she would crack. They leaned in, hungry for the breakdown. Corinne looked at the spreading wet patch on the white cloth. She looked at Mrs. Choi's triumphant smirk. Then, she reached into her small clutch and pulled out a simple linen napkin. She leaned down, not with frantic haste, but with a slow, deliberate grace, and gently dabbed at the edges of the spill. She didn't try to scrub it away. She simply contained the damage. She then straightened up, folded the damp napkin neatly, and placed it back in her purse. She met Mrs. Choi's gaze and gave her a small, polite, and utterly devastating smile. "Accidents happen," Corinne said, her voice calm and even. "I'm sure no one will mind." The lack of reaction was a bucket of ice water on their collective blood sport. She refused to play her assigned role. She was not the hysterical victim. She was not the embarrassed outcast. By refusing to acknowledge the attack, she had stripped it of its power, leaving Mrs. Choi looking foolish and cruel. The crowd deflated, a low hiss of disappointment escaping them. Mrs. Choi's face tightened, the mask of civility cracking to reveal the raw ugliness beneath. She had been publicly outmaneuvered, and in this world, that was a mortal wound to one's reputation. Just then, the music from the string quartet swelled, shifting from a gentle prelude to a triumphant processional. The ceremony was beginning. The guests, robbed of their spectacle, reluctantly turned their attention to the aisle. The groom, a man named Dae-hyun whose face was a handsome but unyielding mask of power, took his place at the altar. And then came the bride. Minjun was a vision in white, her dress a cascade of lace and silk. She was beautiful, but her face was tense. As she walked down the aisle on the arm of a stern-faced older man, her father, her eyes scanned the crowd. For a fleeting second, her gaze locked with Corinne's. There was no warmth in it, but there was no hostility either. It was a look of complex acknowledgement, a flicker of shared history, and, perhaps, a silent apology. Or maybe a warning. Corinne held her breath. Standing beside the groom, waiting, was Jinwoo. 5 years had sharpened the angles of his face, carving away the last vestiges of the young man she had known and leaving behind the formidable man he had become. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, but it was his stillness that commanded attention. He was the center of gravity in this opulent universe, and everything and everyone orbited him. His eyes were fixed on his sister, a rare softness touching their edges. He seemed completely unaware of Corinne's presence. The part of her that had hoped, the tiny, foolish part that had worn this dress for him, shriveled and died. He hadn't invited her.
민윤 must hate.
He didn't even know she was here. The humiliation she had so carefully deflected now came rushing back, a cold, sickening wave. She was nothing but a ghost at the feast. The officiant began to speak, his voice a soothing baritone that washed over the tense assembly. He spoke of love, of union, of two powerful families becoming one. The words were a blur to Corinne. She was planning her escape, calculating the precise moment she could slip away unnoticed during the applause. Dae-hyun, the groom, turned to face Min-jun to say his vows. The entire garden held its breath. This was the pinnacle of the event, the fusion of two dynasties. But as Dae-hyun opened his mouth to speak, a hand was raised. It was Jin-woo. He didn't say a word, just lifted his hand, palm out, in a gesture of unmistakable command. The officiant's voice trailed off into silence. Dae-hyun closed his mouth, his expression unreadable. The string quartet, mid-bow, faltered into a discordant scrape before falling silent. Every single eye in the garden swiveled to Jin-woo. What was happening? Was there an objection? A security threat? The air crackled with confusion and alarm. Mrs. Choi looked positively gleeful, sensing a new, even more delicious drama about to unfold. Jin-woo took a single step away from the altar, breaking the sacred symmetry of the wedding party. He turned, not towards the officiant or his family, but towards the sea of stunned faces. His gaze, which had been soft for his sister, was now hard, sweeping across the rows of guests like a searchlight. It was a look of assessment, of judgment. And then it stopped. It stopped directly on Corinne. For the first time in 5 years, Jin-woo looked at her. And in that look, she saw everything. Regret, longing, and a terrifying, unshakable resolve. The world narrowed to the space between them. The 100 other people, the orchids, the ocean, it all dissolved into an irrelevant blur. He started walking. His steps were measured, silent on the white runner. He walked past the front row, past his own father, who watched with a stony expression. He walked past Mrs. Choi, who was now beginning to look less gleeful and more unnerved. He didn't look at any of them. His eyes were locked on Corinne, an invisible tether pulling him forward. The crowd was a statue garden of slack-jawed disbelief. They had spent the last hour treating this woman like a piece of dirt on a shoe, and now the most powerful man in their circle was walking towards her as if she were the only person in the world. The power dynamic was not just shifting. It was cracking, the tectonic plates of their social order groaning under an immense, unexpected pressure. Corinne's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She couldn't breathe. Was he going to have her thrown out? Was this the final, ultimate humiliation, to be personally ejected by him in front of everyone? Her carefully constructed composure began to crumble. She felt her hands begin to shake. He finally reached her row and stopped, standing in the aisle directly in front of her. The silence was so profound she could hear the blood roaring in her ears. He was so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could smell the faint, familiar scent of sandalwood and clean linen that she thought she'd forgotten. He looked down at her, his expression softening from its hard resolve into something achingly tender. "Corinne," he said. "Her name." He said her name, and the sound of it, spoken in his deep voice, echoed in the unnatural quiet. It wasn't an accusation. It was a prayer. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. He knew her. He knew her name. And then, he did something that shattered their reality completely. Kim Jin-woo, the feared and respected head of his organization, a man who bowed to no one, slowly, deliberately, went down on one knee in the grass before her. A collective gasp, sharp and unified, swept through the garden. Mrs. Choi's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horrified understanding. This was not an eviction. This was an enthronement. Jin-woo ignored the chaos he had unleashed. He looked up at Corinne, his gaze unwavering. 5 years, he said, his voice low but carrying with perfect clarity. For 5 years, I have lived with one regret. Letting you walk away. I told myself it was for your own good, to protect you from this world. I told myself I was being noble. He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating motion. It was a lie. It was cowardice. I was afraid I wasn't strong enough to protect you and to love you at the same time. I spent 5 years becoming strong enough. Strong enough that no one— His eyes flickered for a nanosecond towards Mrs. Choi, a glance as sharp and as cold as a shard of glass— would ever dare to make you feel unwelcome in my world again. From the inner pocket of his tuxedo, he pulled a small, dark blue velvet box. It was worn at the edges, a testament to how long it had been carried. The crowd seemed to shrink in on itself, the guests physically recoiling as if from a bright light. This was impossible. This was a nightmare. This was a coup. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a ring. It was not a delicate engagement ring. It was a statement. A flawless, emerald-cut diamond, easily 10 carats, flanked by 2 smaller but equally perfect sapphires, the exact shade of Corinne's dress. It was a weapon, a crown, a promise, all in one. My sister's wedding today was a beautiful event, Jin-woo continued, his voice resonating with absolute authority. But it was also a trap. I knew you'd come for her. Min-jun sent the invitation, but I wrote the words. I have been waiting for this day. For you, he held the ring up. I'm not asking you to be my girlfriend, Corinne. I'm not asking you to date me. I am done with half measures and lost time. I'm asking you to be my wife. To be the queen of this family, with all the power and protection that comes with it. I'm asking you to marry me. Right here. Right now, he paused, his eyes searching hers. Say yes, and I will spend the rest of my life proving that this is the only world you will ever need. Time seemed to warp and stretch. For Corinne, the shocked faces of the guests, the half-married couple at the altar, the entire opulent scene, it all faded into white noise. There was only Jin-woo, kneeling before her, offering her not just a ring, but a kingdom. He was offering her the one thing she'd never had in his world— absolute, unquestionable power. The power to never be invisible again. Tears she had refused to shed under their scorn now welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of pain. They were tears of overwhelming, heart-stopping relief. The love she had buried under 5 years of scar tissue was still there, beating and alive. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Then, louder, clearer, for everyone to hear. Yes, a slow smile spread across Jin-woo's face, a genuine, breathtaking smile that transformed his severe features into the face of the man she remembered. He took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. The weight of it was immense, a tangible anchor in a world that had just been turned upside down. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I've got you, he murmured, for her ears only. I'll never let you go again, and then he kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of possession, a public sealing of a new covenant in front of 100 stunned witnesses. The kiss broke the spell. The world came rushing back in a cacophony of sound and motion. The bride, Min-jun, began to applaud, a wide, genuine grin on her face. Her new husband, Dae-hyun, joined in, a look of wry respect in his eyes. He had clearly been in on the plan. The staff, the waiters and planners who had watched Corinne with such fear, were now beaming. Their applause was the loudest of all. The guests, however, were a different story. Their shock curdled into panic. The power structure of their universe had been violently rewritten in the span of 5 minutes. The woman they had snubbed, insulted, and tried to humiliate was now, by all appearances, their new matriarch. The looks of terror were almost comical. People who had turned their backs on her were now desperately trying to catch her eye, to offer a fawning, pathetic smile of congratulations. They were tripping over themselves to show their allegiance, their faces masks of strained adoration. Mrs. Choi looked like she had seen a ghost. Her face was ashen, her perfect flamingo suit suddenly looking garish and cheap. Her social world had just been incinerated, and she was standing at ground zero. Jinwoo ended the kiss, but kept Corinne tucked securely at his side, his arm a steel band around her waist. His smile vanished as his gaze swept over the crowd, finally landing on Mrs. Choi. He didn't need to raise his voice. His words were quiet, precise, and absolutely lethal. "Mrs. Choi," he said, the name dropping like a stone into a frozen pond. "I believe your husband's shipping logistics are handled by our West Coast subsidiary." A very delicate arrangement. He let the sentence hang in the air. "I've always found that respect is the most important lubricant for good business. Disrespect, on the other hand, causes friction. It can grind things to a halt." Permanently, he didn't need to say more. He had just signed the social and financial death warrant of the Choi family with a single, veiled threat. Mrs. Choi swayed on her feet, her face a mask of pure terror. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Jinwoo turned his back on her, a final, dismissive gesture. He faced the officiant, who was looking on with a bewildered but professional calm. "Apologies for the interruption," Jinwoo said, his voice now laced with a wry charm. "My sister's ceremony was lovely, but it appears we have a scheduling conflict. We will be needing your services for a second time today." He looked at Minjun and Daehyun. "If you don't mind sharing the spotlight?" Minjun laughed, a bright, happy sound. "Brother, I've been waiting 5 years for this. The spotlight is all yours." She came over and hugged Corinne tightly. "Welcome to the family," she whispered. For real this time, the rest of the day was a surreal blur. While Minjun and Daehyun quickly and happily completed their vows, a small army of staff descended. With a quiet, terrifying efficiency that defined Jinwoo's organization, a second wedding was being prepared. A simple, elegant white dress was produced for Corinne, seemingly out of thin air. A bouquet of sapphire blue hydrangeas was assembled. Legal documents appeared on a silver platter, needing only signatures. Less than an hour after Jinwoo had proposed, Corinne found herself standing beside him at the same floral archway. The guests remained, now prisoners of etiquette, forced to watch the coronation of the woman they had tried to destroy. Their applause this time was thunderous, bordering on frantic, each clap a desperate plea for forgiveness. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Jinwoo turned to her. He didn't kiss her immediately. He just looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, profound love that washed away all the hurt, all the years of loneliness. "You are safe now," he said. "You are home." This kiss was different from the first. It was not a declaration of power for the crowd. It was a quiet promise, meant only for the two of them. It was gentle and deep, a confirmation of a love that had survived time, distance, and the cruelty of a world that didn't understand it. As they walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, the crowd parted for them, an instinctive, deferential movement. Corinne walked with her head held high, the weight of the ring on her finger a comforting reality, the strength of her husband's hand in hers an unbreakable shield. She was no longer an outsider. She was the center. She had walked into the garden as a ghost, but she was leaving it as a queen. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was the end of a perfect day and the beginning of an impossible, beautiful life.